The Flak 39, a weapon once hidden in the shadows of World War II, is now a relic of history. But have you ever wondered how this Super-Flak gun, designed to take down the massive Allied bombers, went from an unknown threat to a key factor in Germany's desperate attempts to hold back the Allies? Its rapid-fire precision, once a deadly surprise, reshaped air warfare during the final years of the war. Today, it sits as a testament to the ingenuity and desperation of the German defense strategy. But how did it manage to turn the skies into a perilous battleground for the Allies? This is the real reason Germany built a Super-Flak, one that the Allies never saw coming. Let's dive into the story of how this weapon shifted the balance of air combat and why the Allies were caught off guard. The early days of World War II saw Germany struggling to keep pace with the rapidly changing nature of air combat. Warfare. The Luftwaffe, once feared for its air superiority, found itself increasingly outmatched by the Allied bombing raids. The Allies' heavy bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Lancaster, were wreaking havoc over German cities and military targets. These bombers were well armored, fast, and capable of delivering devastating payloads deep into enemy territory. The Luftwaffe had been forced to evolve quickly, and their response was to focus on a new generation of ground-based anti-aircraft weapons. The Flak 88 was Germany's answer to the problem. First introduced in the late 1930s, it quickly became one of the most feared weapons on the battlefield. The 88mm cannon was powerful, capable of hitting high-altitude targets with remarkable precision. It was not just used for air defense, but also proved deadly against ground targets like tanks and infantry. But despite its effectiveness, the Flak 88 had its limitations. It was large, heavy, and required a crew of several men to operate. In the fast-paced, ever-changing theater of World War II, this cumbersome weapon was becoming less practical. By the time the Allies launched their strategic bombing campaigns against Germany, the Luftwaffe knew it needed a more versatile and agile air defense system. Thus, the Flak 38 and Flak 39 were born. The Flak 38, introduced in the early stages of the war, was a smaller, more portable version of the Flak 88. It used a 20mm round, which allowed it to fire faster and at a higher rate of fire, making it particularly effective against smaller, faster aircraft. However, it was still somewhat lacking when it came to dealing with the larger, heavily armored Allied bombers. The Germans needed something more. The Flak 39, introduced shortly after, was an improvement on the Flak 38, featuring a more powerful 37mm round. The 37mm Flak 39 was designed specifically to counter the heavy bombers, targeting them with precision and force. It was faster, lighter, and more adaptable than the previous models. The gun could be operated by a smaller crew, and its mobility made it easier to deploy in different combat scenarios. It wasn't just a defensive weapon, it was a game changer. For the first time, Germany had an air defense system that could strike back at the heart of the Allied bomber fleets. Despite these innovations, the deployment of the Flak 38 and Flak 39 came too late for the Allies to fully understand the threat they posed. By the time the new Flak systems were in service, the Allies had already established air superiority over much of Europe. The strategic bombing campaigns, including the raids on Germany's industrial centers, had intensified. As the Allies pushed further into occupied territories, the Germans knew they had to act quickly to regain the advantage in the air. The Flak 39, with its faster firing rate and greater power, was their answer. But even with these advancements, the new Flak systems were deployed in small numbers. The Allies, while aware of the Flak 88's capabilities, were slow to grasp the threat posed by the newer systems. The Germans kept their plans secret, and the Allies focused on their primary objectives, securing victory on the ground By the time the Flak 39 began appearing in greater numbers, the Allies had been lulled into a false sense of security. They were unprepared for the rapid-fire, high-velocity shells that would soon rain down on their bombers. The first encounter with the Flak 39 came unexpectedly. A group of Allied bombers, deep into German-held territory, was carrying out a routine raid when they came under heavy fire. The sky was filled with the deafening roar of explosions as the German flak guns opened fire. The bombers, once confident in their ability to handle any threat, were now at the mercy of the new weapon. The speed and accuracy of the Flak 39 caught the Allied crews off guard. Within moments, several bombers were hit, spiraling out of control as their crews scrambled to bail out. It was a stark reminder that the Germans had developed something far more dangerous than the Allies had anticipated. This first encounter marked the beginning of a new phase in the air war. The Allies, shaken by the unexpected loss of aircraft, began to realize that the Flak 39 posed a serious threat. The weapon was more than just a replacement for the Flak 88. It was a weapon that could turn the tide of battle in the skies. The Allies had no choice but to adapt. New tactics had to be developed to counter the high rate of fire and deadly accuracy of the Flak 39. But for now, the Germans had the upper hand, and the Allies were scrambling to understand just how much danger they were truly in. As the Allies began to experience more devastating losses to the new German flak systems, it became clear that the Flak 39 was not just another anti-aircraft gun. It was a weapon that could change the outcome of the war in the skies, and the Allies were beginning to feel the pressure. The sound of the flak bursting in the air had become a terrifying reality, one that would haunt the skies over Europe for the remainder of the war. But even in the face of this new threat, the Allies had no choice but to press on, hoping that their countermeasures would be enough to turn the tide once again. As the war raged on, the Allies were forced to adapt to a rapidly changing battlefield. The initial encounters with the Flak 39 had left them reeling. These encounters, though scattered and few, had proven to be a wake-up call. The weapon that Germany had quietly introduced was no longer a hidden threat. It was now an undeniable presence in the skies over Europe. With each passing day, the Germans continued to refine and deploy these new anti-aircraft guns, and the Allies struggled to keep up. By the time the summer of 1944 arrived, the Flak 39 was becoming more common across the battlefields of Europe. The Allies, still focused on their strategic bombing campaigns, had to reconsider their tactics. Bombing runs over Germany's industrial hubs had once been considered routine, but now every mission carried the possibility of disaster. The sheer volume of flak fire, combined with the gun's remarkable accuracy, made each bombing run feel like a gamble. The Allies, accustomed to overwhelming the Luftwaffe with their bomber fleets, were now finding themselves outmatched on the ground. The first real confrontation between the Allies and the full force of the Flak 39 came during the bombing raids over the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. As the bombers flew deep into enemy territory, they found themselves faced with an unexpected nightmare. The high-altitude bombers, normally out of reach of most ground-based fire, were now being targeted with pinpoint precision. The new flak systems, scattered across the valley, opened fire on the Allied formations. The rounds tore into the bombers, some bursting through the fuselage, others puncturing engines or exploding near the tail sections. The skies were filled with a deafening roar, and the familiar sight of Allied bombers spiraling downward became an all-too-frequent occurrence. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Bomber crews, once confident in their ability to navigate through enemy defenses, now found themselves under constant attack from an unseen enemy. The Flak 39 was small and quick, making it difficult for crews to locate and destroy the gun positions before they opened fire. With each bomb run, the Allies lost more aircraft, and the casualty rate among the aircrews skyrocketed. Even the most experienced pilots found themselves struggling to avoid the sudden bursts of flak that seemed to come from every direction. One of the most troubling aspects of the Flak 39 was its ability to fire at a high rate. Unlike the larger, slower Flak 88, which required several seconds between shots, the Flak 39 fired nearly as fast as a machine gun. This meant that Allied bombers, once used to dodging single bursts of fire, now had to contend with rapid, continuous barrages that seemed to fill the sky. It was not just the firepower that made the Flak 39 so deadly. It was the relentless pace at which it fired. The gun's effectiveness was magnified by the ability to fire multiple rounds in quick succession, forcing Allied bombers to endure constant barrages without a break. In response to this new threat, the Allies were forced to change their tactics. High-altitude bombing raids became less frequent as pilots sought to avoid the deadly reach of the Flak 39. Instead, they turned to more precise, low-level attacks, hoping to fly below the range of the flak fire. However, this only brought new dangers. The lower they flew, the more vulnerable they became to enemy fighter aircraft, which were already engaged in battle with the Allied bombers. It was a vicious cycle. Each new strategy to counter the Flak 39 brought new challenges, and the losses continued to mount. At the same time, the Allies began to realize that their existing countermeasures were not enough to neutralize the Flak 39. The typical tactics of disrupting enemy fire with smokescreens or evasive maneuvers were simply not effective against the precision of the new weapon. The crews of the bombers needed something more. This realization led to the rapid development of new technologies designed to counteract the deadly barrage of the Flak 39. Jamming systems were introduced to interfere with the targeting of the guns, and new counterflak devices were developed in hopes of disrupting the rapid fire of the German systems. But these new technologies were in their infancy, and many were not fully operational by the time they were needed most. In the midst of this technological arms race, the Allies were also forced to reassess their strategic objectives. The pressure to defeat Germany quickly was immense, but the constant threat of the Flak 39 made it clear that the path to victory would not be as straightforward as they had hoped. The Allies were learning the hard way that, in modern warfare, the most dangerous threats are often the ones that go unnoticed until it is too late. The Flak 39 was a weapon that the Allies had underestimated, and now they were paying the price. As the summer of 1944 wore on, the Allies found themselves in a race against time. The Germans were improving their flak systems, adapting to every countermeasure the Allies introduced. The once bleak landscape of Allied air superiority was beginning to look like a distant memory. And yet, despite the mounting losses, the Allies refused to relent. The stakes had never been higher, and the air war over Europe was on the brink of a dramatic shift. The Flak 39 was proving to be a powerful adversary, but it was far from the final word in the battle for the skies. By the fall of 1944, the full impact of the Flak 39 had become undeniable. Allied bombers, once feared and revered for their ability to strike deep behind enemy lines, were now facing the harsh reality of a weapon that could bring them down with terrifying speed and accuracy. The skies over Germany, once dominated by the roaring engines of Allied bombers, were now a battleground of flak bursts and fighter aircraft. The Allies' air superiority was beginning to slip away, and with it, the belief that their bombing campaigns would bring a swift end to the war. The Germans, however, had not been content with just fielding the Flak 39 inches small numbers. By late 1944, the weapon had become a key part of the German defense strategy. The Flak 39 systems were deployed in greater numbers across the Western Front, including in heavily defended cities like Berlin and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. The German military knew that if they were to hold back the advancing Allies, their new weapon would be a critical asset. For the Allies, however, it was a waking nightmare. The relentless barrage of rapid-fire flak seemed impossible to escape. Every bombing raid became a high-stakes gamble, and the stakes only grew higher with each passing day. The situation grew even more dire as the Allies began to push deeper into German territory. The German air defenses, now bolstered by the widespread use of the Flak 39, were becoming more effective than ever. A bombing raid that would have once been routine was now a deadly challenge. Crews faced a constant hail of flak, and their aircraft, though still powerful, were beginning to show signs of vulnerability. Even the most well-armored bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, were not immune to the new threat. The Flak 39's ability to fire rapidly and with pinpoint accuracy meant that even the slightest misstep could result in disaster. Allied pilots were faced with a new challenge. The Flak 39's precision and speed made evasive maneuvers far less effective. There was no longer any room for error. Pilots who had once relied on altitude and speed to avoid enemy fire now found themselves caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the German flak gunners. They were forced to fly at lower altitudes to avoid the reach of the flak, but this brought them into the range of German fighters who had already been waiting for the opportunity to strike. It was a vicious cycle. The Allies were caught between two deadly threats, with little room to maneuver and even less time to react. The Germans, on the other hand, were benefiting from the effectiveness of their new flak systems. The rapid rate of fire allowed the German defenders to target multiple bombers in quick succession. Even if they missed their target on the first shot, they had plenty of chances to try again. The psychological toll on Allied aircrews was immense. The constant threat of being hit by flak made it difficult to focus on the mission at hand. Bombers, once a symbol of Allied dominance, were now nothing more than targets, and the once proud crews began to feel the weight of the danger they faced. The noise of flak bursts echoed in their ears, a constant reminder that the skies above were no longer their own. As the Flak 39 continued to prove its effectiveness, the Allies were forced to reconsider their bombing strategies. High-altitude raids were no longer a viable option, and low-level strikes brought their own set of dangers. The Allies turned to more specialized tactics, such as night raids and low-level precision strikes, hoping that the cover of darkness would provide them with some protection. However, even these tactics came with risks. The Flak 39's ability to hit fast-moving targets meant that even at night, the threat remained ever-present. Allied aircrews, faced with a rapidly evolving and increasingly deadly threat, were pushed to their limits. The pressure on the Allies only increased as they fought to maintain control of the skies. The Flak 39 was no longer just a weapon. It had become a symbol of the German resolve to defend their homeland at any cost. The Allies had no choice but to adapt, constantly refining their strategies in an attempt to neutralize the threat. But the more they adapted, the more the Germans seemed to anticipate their moves. The Flak 39 was a weapon that forced the Allies to rethink their approach to the war, and for many airmen, it seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. In response to the mounting losses, the Allies began to accelerate their efforts to develop countermeasures. New technology, including improved jamming systems and radar-guided bombs, was brought into play. But even these new tools were not enough to completely neutralize the effectiveness of the Flak 39. The Germans had proven to be just as adaptive as the Allies. They learned to counter Allied countermeasures, making the air war more complex and deadly than ever before. The constant cycle of innovation, response, and counter-response became the new reality of the war in the skies. Despite the growing difficulties, the Allies refused to back down. Every bombing raid was a risk, but it was a risk they had to take. The Germans, on the other hand, were aware that the longer they could hold off the Allied air assaults, the more time they bought for their ground forces. The balance of power in the skies had shifted, but the Allies were not yet ready to concede defeat. As the war entered its final stages, the battle for control of the air was far from over, and the Flak 39 would continue to play a pivotal role in the unfolding drama. By the winter of 1944, the Allies were facing a crisis in the skies over Germany. The Flak 39 had proven to be a formidable weapon, and with its widespread deployment, it had begun to turn the tide of air warfare in favor of the Germans. As the Allies continued their strategic bombing campaigns, they found themselves increasingly vulnerable to the rapid, precise fire of the German anti-aircraft guns. What had once seemed like a minor threat had grown into a major obstacle, forcing the Allies to rethink their approach to air operations. The Germans, aware of the Allies' need for air superiority, had adapted their defense strategies with remarkable speed. The Flak 39 was no longer confined to static positions. It was being used more flexibly, moved around to where the threat was most pressing. This made it even harder for the Allies to pinpoint and destroy the gun positions before they could open fire. The effectiveness of the Flak 39 was only enhanced by its mobility. Whether in urban areas, forests, or open fields, the German forces could position the guns to create a near impenetrable wall of fire. The Allies had no choice but to adapt, but even with new technologies and tactics, the results were far from guaranteed. Allied air crews, already exhausted from months of intense combat, now found themselves facing an even more daunting challenge. As the German defenses grew stronger, the Allies began to suffer greater losses. Pilots who had survived countless missions were being shot down by the Flak 39, while bombers once thought to be nearly invincible were now vulnerable targets. The psychological toll on the crews was immense. The constant threat of being hit by flak took a toll on their morale. The roar of the explosions and the shudder of the aircraft under fire became all too familiar, and each mission felt more like a death sentence than a strategic operation. The Allies had no choice but to make significant changes to their tactics. High-altitude raids, which had been their main method of bombing, were now seen as too risky. Even the best bombers were no match for the speed and precision of the Flak 39. The Allies began to experiment with low-level bombing runs, hoping to fly beneath the reach of the German guns. However, this tactic came with its own set of dangers. Flying at low altitudes made the bombers more vulnerable to German fighters, who were waiting just below the flak zone. It was a delicate balance, lowering the altitude to avoid the flak, but risking a direct encounter with enemy fighters. The constant shifting of strategies reflected just how desperate the situation had become. Meanwhile, the Germans were not standing still. They had recognized the increasing effectiveness of their Flak 39 systems and were working tirelessly to improve them. New modifications were made to enhance the gun's accuracy, and its rate of fire was fine-tuned to target multiple bombers in quick succession. The Germans had also begun to implement new tactics for using the flak guns. They organized their defenses into coordinated networks, with different flak positions working together to cover each other and ensure no part of the sky was left unguarded. The Allies, already stretched thin with their bombing campaigns, were finding it increasingly difficult to break through these defensive networks. One of the most significant developments came in the form of improved radar systems. These systems allowed the Germans to track Allied bombers more accurately and direct their flak guns with deadly precision. The Allies, in turn, had to scramble to develop countermeasures, New jamming devices were introduced, aimed at disrupting the German radar and making it harder for them to lock onto targets. However, these countermeasures were not always reliable, and the Germans quickly adapted, finding ways to bypass the jamming signals. The air war had become a game of cat and mouse, with each side developing new technologies to counter the other's advances. As the war progressed, the Allies began to shift their focus to disrupting the German supply lines and targeting their industrial centers. Bombing runs were now concentrated on key infrastructure, such as transportation hubs, factories, and oil refineries. These targets were vital to the German war effort, and the Allies hoped that by crippling these supply lines, they could bring the war to a quicker conclusion. However, these raids were no longer as effective as they had once been. The Flak 39, combined with the ever-present threat of German fighter planes, made each bombing raid more dangerous than the last. The Allies had to reconsider their objectives, understanding that every raid came at a high cost. The shift in tactics also brought a change in the way the Allies approached their overall strategy. The bombing campaigns, once seen as a way to break the German war machine, now seemed to have reached a stalemate. The Luftwaffe's air defenses had become more than just a nuisance. They had become a serious threat to the Allies' air superiority. The Allies had to focus more on strategic objectives, shifting away from indiscriminate bombing to more targeted strikes that could cripple Germany's ability to continue fighting. This new focus was a sign of how much the air war had changed. What had once been seen as a decisive weapon in the war was now a complex and costly endeavor, with no easy solutions in sight. By the end of 1944, the Allies had begun to realize the full scope of the challenge they faced. The Flak 39 had proven itself to be a game-changing weapon, and the Allies were struggling to find an answer. The Germans had successfully adapted to the Allied tactics, and now the Allies were on the defensive in the skies. The air war, which had once been dominated by Allied bombers, was now a tense and unpredictable battlefield. The Allies were not ready to give up, but the cost of victory in the skies had risen dramatically. As the war moved into its final stages, the battle for control of the air would remain a critical and uncertain aspect of the conflict. As the winter of 1944 stretched into the cold months of 1945, the Allies found themselves engaged in a war that was far more complex than they had ever anticipated. The Flak 39, which had once been a hidden threat, had grown into a powerful and deadly force. Its rapid fire, pinpoint accuracy, and widespread deployment had taken a heavy toll on the Allied air forces. The situation was dire, and the Allies had to adapt quickly if they were to maintain any hope of achieving air superiority over Germany. The Flak 39 had already proven to be a formidable weapon, but the Germans were constantly improving it. New modifications were made to enhance the range and accuracy of the guns, allowing them to cover even greater areas. The Allies were forced to develop new tactics to counter the ever-growing threat, but their efforts were constantly met with setbacks. The constant barrage of fire from the Flak 39 systems made each mission feel like a gamble. Even with the latest countermeasures, the threat of being hit by flak fire loomed large over every bombing run. The Allies began to experiment with new technologies to counter the Flak 39, including improved jamming systems and electronic countermeasures. These systems were designed to disrupt the targeting systems of the German guns, making it harder for them to lock on to Allied bombers. However, the Germans quickly adapted to these new measures. They refined their radar and targeting systems, making it harder for the Allies to interfere with their operations. The race between the two sides to develop countermeasures had become a never-ending cycle, with each side constantly trying to outsmart the other. The strain on Allied air crews was immense as the war dragged on. the number of experienced pilots dwindled. Many had been lost to the constant onslaught of flak fire, while others had been forced to retire due to the mental and physical toll of flying in such dangerous conditions. The newer pilots, though eager to contribute, lacked the experience necessary to survive the increasingly hostile skies. The loss of so many skilled airmen made it harder for the Allies to maintain their bombing campaigns. The pressure on the remaining pilots grew with each mission, as they faced the constant threat of flak fire and enemy fighters. Despite these challenges, the Allies were not willing to give up on their strategic bombing campaigns. The German war machine was still a formidable force, and the only way to break its back was through continued bombing of its vital industrial and military targets. However, the cost of these operations was becoming clear. The toll on Allied bombers was growing, and the losses of aircraft and crews were rising. Even with the best countermeasures in place, the Flak 39 was proving to be a nearly insurmountable obstacle. The Luftwaffe's air defenses had become more than just a nuisance. They had become a key part of the German strategy to hold back the Allies. The Germans had learned from their previous failures, and they had adapted their tactics to make the most of the Flak 39. They positioned the guns in such a way that they created overlapping fields of fire, making it nearly impossible for bombers to find a safe path through the sky. The once reliable strategies of high-altitude bombing and precise strikes were now rendered nearly useless by the constant threat of the German flak guns. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany in the winter of 1945, the situation in the skies grew more dire. The need for air superiority had never been more urgent, yet the Germans were holding their ground. The Flak 39 was no longer just a weapon. It had become a symbol of the German resilience and determination to fight to the end. The Allies had to find a way to overcome this threat if they were to win the war, but every step forward seemed to bring them closer to disaster. The tactical situation reached a boiling point as the Allies began to consider new strategies to counter the Flak 39. One of the most controversial ideas was to focus on smaller, more specialized bombing runs that could target the flak positions directly. This approach was risky, as it required flying low and slow over heavily defended areas, putting the bombers in range of both flak guns and enemy fighters. The risks were high, but the potential rewards were even greater. If the Allies could destroy the German flak positions, they could regain some of the air superiority they had lost. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was a gamble the Allies were willing to take. At the same time, the Allies began to intensify their efforts to disrupt the German war effort on the ground. Strategic bombing raids were now focused on key infrastructure railroads, oil refineries, and factories. By targeting these vital supply lines, the Allies hoped to cripple Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. However, the Flak 39 made it much harder to carry out these operations. The Germans had learned to defend their vital industries with a combination of flak defenses and fighter cover, making every bombing raid a high-risk operation. As the Allies launched more raids against German cities and industrial centers, the toll on their forces continued to rise. The Flak 39's effectiveness in the defense of these targets could not be overstated. It was a weapon that had caught the Allies off guard, and now it was proving to be a decisive factor in the battle for air superiority. The Germans had gained a significant advantage in the air, and the Allies were struggling to keep up. Yet, despite the mounting losses and the growing threat of the Flak 39, the Allies refused to back down. The war was nearing its end, and the Germans were on the defensive. The Allies knew that the final push was coming. They had to find a way to break the German defenses, and they had to do it soon. The Flak 39 had proven to be a formidable weapon, but it was not invincible. The Allies were determined to find a way to defeat it, no matter the cost. By the spring of 1945, The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the battle for control of the skies was still being fiercely contested. The Allies had pushed deep into German territory, and the collapse of Nazi Germany was imminent. However, the threat of the Flak 39 remained a constant danger. Despite the mounting losses and the relentless pressure, the Allies were not willing to give up their efforts to achieve air superiority. The Flak 39, though a formidable weapon, had not yet won the war for Germany, and the Allies were determined to finish what they had started. The Flak 39 had proven itself as one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons of the war. Its rapid-fire capabilities and deadly precision had made it a key part of Germany's defensive strategy. However, as the Allies continued to advance, the Flak 39's ability to stop them began to diminish. The Germans, already stretched thin on the battlefield, could not keep up with the demands of the war. The Allies were relentless, and the final assault on Germany was beginning to take shape. The German forces, though still determined, were on the defensive. They had been battered by months of Allied bombing raids, and their ability to fight back was fading. The Flak 39, once their primary tool for defending against the Allied air assault, could no longer stop the overwhelming force that the Allies were bringing to bear. The Allies had adapted their tactics and developed new technologies that allowed them to overcome the threat of the Flak 39. Precision bombing, long-range fighters, and radar-guided munitions all played a role in neutralizing the threat posed by the German anti-aircraft guns. In the final months of the war, the Allies began to systematically dismantle Germany's air defenses. Key flak positions were targeted in coordinated bombing raids, and the German flak guns were either destroyed or rendered ineffective. The destruction of these key defenses marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The Allies, having learned from the lessons of the past, were now able to conduct their bombing raids with greater success. The skies, once ruled by the Flak 39, were now open to the Allies once again. However, the Flak 39 did not simply fade away. The Germans continued to fight until the very end, and the gun remained a potent symbol of their resistance. In the final months of the war, the Germans used the remaining Flak 39 guns in desperate attempts to slow the Allied advance. The guns were positioned in the few remaining strongholds, and even as the Allies closed in on Berlin, the Flak 39 continued to fire into the sky. But by then, it was too little, too late. The tide of the war had already turned, and the Allies were on the brink of victory. The Allies finally entered Berlin in early May of 1945. The German capital, which had once seemed impregnable, had been reduced to rubble by months of bombing and ground assaults. The Flak 39, once a powerful force that had threatened the very heart of the Allied bombing campaigns, was now a relic of a lost cause. Its rapid-fire bursts could no longer prevent the inevitable fall of Berlin, and the war in Europe came to an end. In the aftermath of the war, the legacy of the Flak 39 lived on. It had been one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons of its time, and its role in defending Germany against Allied bombing raids could not be denied. However, its impact on the outcome of the war was limited. Despite the damage it caused, the Flak 39 was ultimately unable to prevent the collapse of Nazi Germany. The Allies had adapted, and their overwhelming air superiority, combined with the final destruction of the German war machine, led to the victory in Europe. The Flak 39, like many of the weapons used during World War II, became a symbol of both the technological advances and the tragedies of the war. Its effectiveness as a defensive weapon was undeniable, but it also served as a reminder of the brutal and relentless nature of the conflict. The skies over Germany, once filled with the sounds of flak bursts and the roar of Allied bombers, had finally gone silent. The war had come to an end, and the Allies had emerged victorious, but the memory of the Flak 39 and the air battles it helped shape would live on. The war was over, but the lessons learned from the battle for control of the skies would shape military strategy for decades to come. The Flak 39 had been a powerful weapon, but it was ultimately no match for the determination and adaptability of the Allies. As the world moved forward into the post-war era, the story of the Flak 39 became a part of the history of the war, a reminder of the ingenuity, resilience, and sacrifice of those who fought in the skies above Europe. The battle for air superiority had been fierce, but in the end, the Allies had prevailed.